The room went silent the moment Dante Bell took off his catering jacket. 10 seconds earlier, everyone in Helena Voss's glass-walled mansion had been laughing at him. To them, he was just a poor server with tired eyes, worn shoes, and a tray full of champagne glasses he could never afford to drink from. Helena, a billionaire who had grown bored of ordinary cruelty, had pointed at her massive bodyguard and smiled like she had invented the perfect game. "One punch," she said, loud enough for every diamond-covered guest to hear. "Stand still, let Grant hit you once, and if you don't fall, I'll give you $1 million. The crowd gasped, then laughed harder. They expected Dante to refuse, or better yet accept, and collapse like entertainment bought for the evening. But Dante thought of his 6-year-old daughter June, asleep in a small apartment across town, needing winter boots, school fees, and a future he could not yet give her. So he set down the tray and said, "Okay." That was when everything changed. Because when Grant Maddox stepped forward, ready to throw the punch, he saw something beneath Dante's rolled-up sleeves, something in his stance, his shoulders, his stillness, his face drained of color. The giant bodyguard backed away as if he had just recognized a ghost. Helena snapped, "What are you doing? Hit him!" But Grant shook his head, terrified, and whispered, "Ma'am, please call it off. You don't know who this man is." The laughter died instantly. Helena frowned, suddenly unsure. The guests leaned in, and Dante, the poor single father they had mocked all night, stood calmly in the center of the room, hiding a past so dangerous that the strongest man in the mansion would rather lose his job than raise a hand against him. By the time Dante Bell arrived at the Voss estate that evening, the winter sky had already turned the color of cold steel, and the city behind him looked like something he could no longer afford to belong to. He stepped out of the catering van with a black vest folded over one arm, polished shoes that had been repaired twice, and a quiet heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the freezing air. In his pocket was a grocery receipt he had stared at 3 times that morning, trying to understand how bread, milk, eggs, and a small box of cereal could leave him with barely enough money to pay the heating bill. At home across town in a 2-bedroom apartment where the windows rattled when the wind hit them wrong, his 6-year-old daughter June was probably sitting at the kitchen table with her crayons, drawing the same thing she had drawn all week: a little house with a yard, a swing, and a yellow door. Dante had smiled when she showed it to him, because fathers learn to smile even when their hearts are breaking. "That's a beautiful house, baby," he had told her. June had looked up with the innocent seriousness only children have and asked, "Do you think we'll ever live somewhere like that?" Dante had almost said, "One day," but the words stuck in his throat because he had promised himself he would never lie to her, not even softly. So he kissed the top of her head and said, "I'm working on it." That was the truth. He was always working on it. He worked warehouse shifts before sunrise, carried furniture for men half his age, cleaned office floors after business people went home, and served champagne to rich strangers on weekends. He was not ashamed of honest work. Shame to Dante belonged to people who looked down on those who did it. Still, there were nights when his body ached so badly he had to sit on the edge of the bathtub before taking off his boots. And mornings when June would ask why his hands were swollen, and he would say, "Just tired hands," as if hands could be tired without the man attached to them being tired too. But those hands had once made him famous. Years ago, before the cheap apartment and the overdue bills and the black catering vest, Dante Bell had been known by another name in another world. Sports writers called him the man who never touched the canvas. Fighters called him a nightmare. Fans called him unbreakable. 32 professional fights, 32 victories, and not one opponent had ever put him down. He was not the flashiest man in the ring, not the loudest, not the one who danced for cameras or promised destruction at press conferences. But he had something that made people lean forward when he fought. He did not fall. Men hit him clean. Men hit him hard. Men hit him with everything pride, hunger, and fear could give them. And Dante would absorb it, reset his feet, lift his guard, and keep coming. His old coach, Bram Wilder, used to say Dante had a steel beam where other men had a spine. "Your gift isn't your punch," Bram told him once after a brutal training session. "Your gift is that something inside you refuses to give the world the satisfaction of seeing you drop." At the peak of his career, Dante was one fight away from a championship bout and the kind of money that could have bought June's yellow door house before she was old enough to dream of it. Then everything changed in a hospital hallway. His last fight had been against Rory Keane, a young fighter with sharp eyes, quick feet, and a mother in the front row who clasped her hands every time her son took a hit. Rory was talented, brave, and desperate to prove he belonged. In the 7th round, Dante threw a right hand he had thrown thousands of times before. It landed clean, too clean. Rory went down and the sound of the crowd disappeared from Dante's memory, replaced by the sight of doctors rushing into the ring by the stretcher, by the ambulance lights cutting through the night. For 3 days, Rory lay in a coma, and Dante sat outside a hospital room with his head in his hands, staring at the very hands that had built his career. He had always known boxing was dangerous. Every fighter knows. They sign the forms, hear the warnings, accept the risks. But danger becomes something else when you see a mother walk past you toward her son's bed and know your hands are the reason she is crying. On the second night, Dante's wife, Lena, went into labor. He drove from one hospital to another, from the worst fear of his life into the brightest light of it. And when the nurse placed newborn June in his arms, Dante felt something inside him break open. The same hands that had nearly killed a young man were now holding a life that trusted him completely. He looked down at his daughter's tiny face and made a promise without speaking it aloud. These hands would never be used in anger again. A week later, he walked away from the title shot, the fame, the fortune, and every door the fight game had opened for him. People called him crazy. His manager cursed him. His coach begged him to reconsider. But Lena understood. She told him she would rather raise their daughter with a poor man who came home whole than with a rich man slowly destroyed by violence. For a while, that was enough. They were poor, but there was laughter. Then Lena got sick, fast and cruel, and 2 years later, Dante was standing alone at her grave, with June's small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, learning that there were some fights strength could not win. Since then, everything he did was for June. Every swallowed insult, every double shift, every aching morning, every quiet no when she asked for something he could not buy. That was why he had accepted the catering job at Helena Voss's mansion. The pay was better than usual, and June needed winter boots before the first heavy snow. The estate rose at the top of a private hill, all glass walls, marble steps, and warm golden lights spilling out onto a driveway filled with cars worth more than Dante had earned in years. Inside, the house smelled of expensive perfume, polished wood, and food arranged so delicately no hungry person would have thought to call it dinner. Guests moved through the ballroom in tailored suits and shining gowns, laughing with the loose confidence of people who had never wondered whether a bill could wait another week. Dante became what servers are expected to become in rooms like that, invisible. He refilled glasses, cleared plates, stepped aside without being asked, and kept his face calm. Then Helena Voss noticed him. She was standing beneath a chandelier surrounded by admirers, her silver dress catching the light like a blade. She had the beauty of someone used to being obeyed and the smile of someone who had discovered that cruelty could make a dull evening more amusing. At first, it was only a comment about his vest. Then a joke about how carefully he watched the champagne as if he wanted to steal a sip. Her friends laughed and Dante kept moving. The old part of him, the part that had once answered disrespect with fists and footwork, stirred somewhere deep inside, but he pushed it down. He was not that man anymore. He had June waiting at home, and he would not let a bored billionaire drag him back into the body he had buried. But his silence did not satisfy Helena. It challenged her. Every time Dante refused to react, her eyes sharpened. She called him over again and again, each remark louder than the last, until other guests began watching, sensing a performance. Dante felt the heat of humiliation rise in his face, but he held the tray steady. Then Helena looked him up and down, glanced at the massive bodyguard standing behind her, and smiled as if she had just found the perfect game. "You look like a man who could use money," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "So let's make this interesting. My guard, Grant Maddox, hits you once. One punch. If you stay on your feet, I give you $1 million. The room erupted in laughter, but Dante heard only one thing. $1 million. A house. June's school. Her future. A life where he would never again have to turn hope into maybe next time. He looked at Helena, then at the bodyguard, then down at the hands he had promised would never hurt anyone again. And slowly, carefully, Dante set his tray on the nearest table. For one long second after Dante Bell set the tray down, nobody in Helena Voss's ballroom seemed to breathe. The laughter was still there, hanging in the air like perfume and smoke, but now it had sharpened into anticipation. The rich men in tailored suits leaned forward with their glasses halfway to their mouths. The women in glittering gowns turned their heads as if a private show had suddenly begun just for them. Helena smiled wider, delighted that the poor server had not run because to her, his agreement was not courage, it was desperation, and desperation was something she believed money had the right to purchase. "Well, look at that," she said, her voice smooth and cruel. "He's braver than he looks." A few guests laughed. Someone near the fireplace muttered that this was insane, but not loudly enough to stop it. Nobody wanted to be the person who ruined Helena Voss's entertainment. Dante heard all of it, every laugh, every whisper, every tiny sound of expensive amusement, and he felt the old heat moving through his blood. It rose from somewhere he had spent years burying a dark, familiar pressure behind his ribs. Once that feeling had carried him into rings under bright lights. Once it had made men step backward before the bell even rang. Once, if a room full of people had laughed at him like this, Dante would have shown them exactly why laughter could become fear in a single heartbeat. But that man was dead, or at least he was supposed to be. Dante looked down at his hands. They were not wrapped in tape now. They were not wearing gloves. They were bare, rough from warehouse work, cracked from winter air marked by years of honest labor. These were the hands that packed June's lunch in the morning, tied her shoelaces when she was too sleepy to do it right, brushed crumbs from her cheek, and held her when she woke from dreams about her mother. These were not weapons anymore. He had promised that. And yet here he stood, being invited back into violence by a woman who thought $1 million could turn any man into a thing. Grant Maddox, the bodyguard, stepped forward slowly. Up close, he was even larger than he had looked from across the room, broad through the chest, thick-necked with the quiet heaviness of a man paid to end problems before they reached his employer. He did not seem eager exactly, but he did not seem troubled either. To him, at first, Dante was only a catering worker who had agreed to a stupid bet. A sad man, a poor man, an easy man. Helena lifted her glass toward Grant as if giving permission at a theater. "One punch," she said, "and don't embarrass me by being gentle." Another ripple of laughter moved through the guests. Dante did not look at them. He looked at Grant, then past him toward the reflection in the tall glass wall, where he could see himself standing under the chandelier in a white shirt and black vest, looking smaller than he felt and poorer than he wanted to be. For a moment, the shame almost swallowed him. He imagined June, years from now, asking how their life changed, and he imagined telling her the truth, that her father let himself be mocked in a billionaire's mansion because he loved her more than his pride. The thought steadied him. Pride had never paid rent. Pride had never bought winter boots. Pride had never filled a refrigerator or sent a little girl on a school trip with the rest of her class. He had seen proud men lose everything because they could not bow for a moment when love required it. Dante would not be one of them. He took a slow breath and began to remove his catering jacket. The room grew louder, guests clapping now, encouraging the spectacle. Helena watched him with bright, mean curiosity, as if she wanted to see whether his hands would shake. They did not. Dante folded the jacket carefully, not because the moment deserved care, but because the jacket belonged to the company that had hired him, and a working man did not mistreat what he could not afford to replace. He placed it on the back of a chair. Then he rolled up his sleeves. The movement was small, ordinary, almost boring, but something changed in the air around him. It was not something the guests understood. They only saw muscle where they had expected weakness, old scars along his forearms, shoulders, built by more than carrying trays. But Grant saw more. Dante felt the bodyguard's attention sharpen. It moved over him like a hand searching for the outline of a hidden blade. Dante did not mean to stand like a fighter. He had not chosen the stance consciously. But the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. His left foot settled half a step forward. His chin lowered, his shoulders loosened. His weight dropped into the floor, balanced and quiet. He was not preparing to attack. He was preparing to receive. That was different, but only another fighter would know how different. Grant's expression changed so quickly that Dante almost missed it. The bored professionalism vanished first, then the mild contempt, then the certainty. Something like recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by disbelief. And after that came fear, real fear. Not the fear of being hit by a stronger man, but the fear of a man who has just realized he has been ordered to cross a line he should never cross. Dante saw Grant's right hand loosen at his side. The bodyguard swallowed once. Helena, too drunk on power to notice the shift, waved her fingers impatiently. "Well, get on with it!" Grant did not move. The room, sensing the delay, quieted by a fraction. Dante understood then that the problem had changed. A minute earlier, the question had been whether he could take the punch. Now the question was whether the punch would happen at all. And strangely, Dante felt no relief. He had already made the decision. He had accepted the humiliation, accepted the risk, accepted the room's laughter. Because on the other side of it stood June's future. If Grant refused, what then? Would Helena laugh and withdraw the offer? Would this entire night become only another wound Dante had swallowed for nothing? His mind, which had been burning with shame, became cold and clear. He did not need to prove he was strong. He did not need to prove he had once been dangerous. He needed to leave that house with a chance for his daughter. That was the only victory that mattered. So Dante looked directly at Grant and said quietly, "It's all right. Do what you were told." The words were calm, but they cost him more than anyone in that room could have known. Grant stared at him, and something in his face almost broke. "No," he whispered. Helena's smile faded. "Excuse me." Grant took one step back. The guests stopped laughing altogether now. Even the music seemed too soft to hide the silence. Helena's voice hardened. "Grant, I pay you extremely well. Hit him." But Grant shook his head again, slower this time, his eyes never leaving Dante. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had lost its bodyguard's polish. It sounded human now, shaken and pleading. "Please call it off." Helena's cheeks flushed with anger. "Have you lost your mind?" Grant turned toward her, but he kept his body angled away from Dante, almost like a soldier refusing to aim at a flag he still respected. "You don't understand," he said. "You don't know who this man is." A murmur passed through the room. Helena looked from Grant to Dante, annoyed, confused, beginning at last to feel the first small crack in her control. Dante stood in the center of the ballroom with his sleeves rolled up, his hands open, his heart pounding not from fear of pain, but from fear that his daughter's future was slipping away because the one man hired to strike him had recognized the man he used to be. Grant's face had gone pale now, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone heard it. "I can't hit him," he said. "I won't." Helena stepped closer, furious enough to forget her audience. "He is a waiter!" she snapped. Grant looked at Dante with a kind of stunned reverence that made the room feel smaller. "No," he said, "he's not just a waiter." And in that terrible, breathless pause, Dante realized the past he had buried for his daughter was about to rise in front of everyone. Grant Maddox said Dante Bell's name as if he were speaking it in a church, and the effect on the room was immediate. At first, there was only confusion, the kind that appears on wealthy faces when reality refuses to obey them. Then one of the older men near the bar lowered his glass and whispered, "Dante Bell, the fighter." Another guest turned sharply. Someone else pulled out a phone. Within seconds, the name began moving through Helena Voss's ballroom like a match dropped onto dry paper. Dante Bell, the undefeated contender. Dante Bell, the man who had never been knocked down. Dante Bell, the fighter who disappeared before a title shot and left half the sports world arguing about why. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier did not simply fade. It collapsed. People who had smirked at Dante's vest now stared at his hands, his shoulders, his face, searching for the legend underneath the server's uniform. Dante felt all those eyes on him, and strangely, it hurt worse than the mockery. Being laughed at as a poor man was something he understood. Being recognized as the man he had buried was different. It felt like someone had opened a grave he had spent years covering with work grief and fatherhood. Helena stood very still, her mouth slightly open, the command gone from her posture. She looked at Grant, then at Dante, then at the guests who were beginning to murmur with the hungry excitement of people who realized the entertainment had become something far more serious than they expected. Grant stepped forward again, not toward Dante, but toward Helena, placing himself between his employer's cruelty and the man he had once admired. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but firm now, "you need to stop this." Helena's eyes flashed, embarrassed by the fact that her own bodyguard had corrected her in front of everyone. "Do not tell me what I need to do in my own house," she said. Grant did not back down. "Then hear it from someone who knows what he's looking at. This man could have taken that punch and stayed standing. Easily. But that isn't the point. The point is that you spent the night treating him like an object because you thought he had no power. You were wrong." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Dante saw it happening. The room was beginning to turn not toward kindness, but toward spectacle. Rich people did not stop being cruel just because they discovered their victim was famous. Sometimes they only became more interested. Phones were raised more openly now. A woman in a green dress whispered, "Is this real?" A man beside her was already searching Dante's name online. Dante's first instinct was not to defend his pride, but to protect June. If this spread, if his past became public again, if old clips of knockouts and blood and commentary found their way back into the world, his daughter might one day see the version of him he had worked so hard to leave behind. That fear moved him into action. He took a slow step forward and lifted one open hand, not threatening, not pleading, simply asking the room to stop. "Nobody needs to film this," he said quietly. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "This isn't a show." A man near the fireplace laughed nervously. "It became a show when you agreed to get punched for $1 million. Dante turned toward him, and the man's smile vanished before Dante even spoke. "I agreed because I have a daughter," Dante said, "not because I wanted to entertain you." The room went still again, but the stillness was thinner now, strained by curiosity and shame. Helena swallowed, her face tightening as if she wanted to regain control, but could not find the right cruelty fast enough. "So what do you want?" she asked. "An apology?" Applause. The check. Dante looked at her for a long moment. This was the decision that mattered. He could humiliate her. He could let Grant keep talking, let the guests keep discovering who he had been, let the fear in the room grow until Helena Voss felt as small as she had tried to make him feel. There was a part of him that wanted that. He would not lie to himself. There was a bitter satisfaction waiting there, bright and easy, the kind of satisfaction that says a person has earned their punishment. But Dante had learned years ago that easy satisfaction was often just another name for falling. He thought of June again not as a reason to take the punch now, but as a reason to stay the man she believed he was. "I want this to end without anyone getting hurt," he said. "That's all." For a brief moment, it seemed as if the room might accept that. Then the unexpected voice came from the back of the crowd. "That's a noble speech from a man who put Rory Keane in a coma." The words hit Dante harder than any fist in that room could have. Every head turned toward a thin, silver-haired guest standing near the staircase, a man with a phone in one hand and a cruel certainty in his eyes. Dante did not know him, but he knew the name the man had spoken. Rory Keane. The hospital hallway, the mother walking past, the 3 days of waiting, the newborn in his arms, the promise. Helena, sensing a new opening, looked quickly at the man. "What did you say?" The guest raised his phone as if presenting evidence in court. "Rory Keane, 7th round. Dante Bell ended that boy's career, almost ended his life. So forgive me if I'm not moved by the gentle father routine." A murmur rolled through the ballroom, darker this time. The story was changing again. Moments ago, Dante had been the poor server revealed as a legend. Now he was becoming something else, a dangerous man with blood in his past. Grant spun toward the guest. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Dante lifted a hand to stop him. This was the real test. Not Helena's offer, not Grant's refusal, not the room learning his name. The real test was whether Dante could stand in front of strangers while the worst moment of his life was dragged into the light and still refuse to become the man they feared. His throat felt tight, but his voice remained steady. "He's not wrong," Dante said. The room quieted so completely that Dante could hear the soft hum of the heating vents. Rory Keane lived, thank God, but he was hurt badly because of a punch I threw. A legal punch in a legal fight, but that doesn't make the memory clean. I sat in a hospital for 3 days thinking I might have killed someone's son. Then my daughter was born, and I held her with the same hands that had done that damage. That was the day I quit. Not because I was afraid to fight, because I was afraid of what fighting had made normal to me. The guest with the phone looked less certain now, but he tried to hold on to his accusation. "So now you're a saint?" Dante shook his head. "No, I'm a father trying not to waste the second chance I was given." Those words landed differently from anything else said that night. No drama, no threat, no performance. Just a truth so plain that nobody could dress it up as weakness. Helena's face changed as she listened, not completely. Not enough to call it redemption, but enough for Dante to see a crack. She had expected fear, anger, maybe greed. She had not expected accountability. She had not expected a man who could admit the worst thing about himself without using it as an excuse to become worse. Grant's eyes shone with something fierce and loyal, but Dante did not let himself look too long. He needed to finish this before the room found another way to turn his pain into entertainment. He picked up his catering jacket from the chair and put it back on slowly. The act seemed to confuse everyone more than any speech could have. "Ms. Voss," he said, turning to Helena, "you offered money because you thought humiliation was something you could buy. I accepted because my daughter needs a future. But I won't be part of this room turning pain into sport anymore. Not mine, not Rory Keane's, not Grant's, not anybody's." Helena said nothing. The phone in the silver-haired man's hand lowered. The guests who had been eager to watch a poor man fall were now forced to watch him stand in a way none of them had expected. Dante adjusted his cuffs, lifted his tray again, and for the first time that night he understood the conflict had never been about whether he could survive a punch. It was about whether he could survive humiliation, recognition, accusation, and temptation without betraying the promise that made him June's father. And as he turned to leave the circle, Helena finally spoke, but her voice no longer sounded amused. "Wait," she said. Dante stopped, not because she commanded him, but because something in her voice had changed. "Don't go yet." Dante did not move right away. Helena Voss's words hung behind him softer than any command she had given all night, and for that reason they stopped him more effectively than anger ever could have. "Don't go yet," she had said, but there was no sharpness in it now, no bored cruelty, no rich woman's certainty that the world would arrange itself around her wishes. It sounded almost like a request, and that made the entire ballroom uneasy. People who had spent the last hour laughing at Dante now stood frozen with their glasses lowered, unsure whether they were still guests at a party or witnesses to something they would rather not understand. Dante turned slowly, the tray balanced in one hand, the catering jacket back on his shoulders, the old fighter hidden again beneath the uniform of a working man. Helena looked smaller than she had a few minutes earlier, though nothing about her had changed. Her diamond earrings still caught the chandelier light. Her silver dress still looked like it cost more than Dante's car. The mansion still belonged to her, the staff still worked for her, the guards still watched her for direction. But power had shifted in a way everyone could feel. It had not moved from her to Dante because he was dangerous. It had moved because he had refused to become dangerous when every person in that room had given him permission to do so. Helena glanced around and finally seemed to notice the phones, the hungry faces, the shame disguised as curiosity. "Put them away," she said. A few guests hesitated. Her voice strengthened, but not into cruelty this time. Into something like responsibility. "All of you, put your phones away. This man is not your entertainment." Slowly, one by one, screens lowered. The silver-haired guest who had mentioned Rory Keane looked embarrassed now, but Dante did not feel victory in that embarrassment. He felt tired. The kind of tired that came after holding a door shut inside yourself while something violent tried to get out. Grant Maddox remained a few steps away, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Dante, as if he still could not accept that his childhood hero had been reduced to standing in a ballroom while strangers debated his pain. Helena took a breath and faced Dante. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words were careful, almost unfamiliar in her mouth. Not a polite one, not the kind people say because the room expects it, a real one. Dante did not answer. He had learned that silence could make people reveal more of themselves than argument ever did. Helena looked down at the glass in her hand as though seeing it for the first time, then set it on a nearby table. "I was cruel to you because I could be," she continued, "because I thought money made the difference between a person who mattered and a person who could be used. I treated you like a toy. I treated your dignity like something I could purchase for the amusement of my friends." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, and for the first time that night, no one laughed. Dante watched her closely, not with hatred, but with caution. He knew apologies could be another kind of performance, especially from people who were used to controlling rooms. But he also knew what it looked like when a person truly saw themselves and did not like what they saw. Helena was not transformed into goodness in an instant. Life was not that simple. But something had cracked. He could see the crack. "You didn't know me," Dante said. "That was the problem." Helena nodded, but Dante shook his head gently. "No, I don't mean you didn't know my name. I mean you didn't know anything about me, and you decided that was enough to make me less than you." The words landed heavily because they were not shouted. Helena's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. Dante felt his own chest tighten as the night finally began to reach him. He had stayed calm through the insults, through the offer, through Grant's recognition, through the accusation about Rory. But calm was not the same as numb. The humiliation had entered him. The memories had entered him. The sight of strangers raising phones while his worst regret was spoken aloud had entered him. And beneath all of it was the oldest wound, the fear that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sacrificed, June might still inherit the weight of his poverty. "I accepted your bet because my little girl needed a future," he said, his voice lower now. "That is the part everyone in this room should understand. Not the boxing record, not the old fights, not whether I could take a punch. I stood here because I was trying to be a father." Helena's face changed again, and this time the shame in it became something more human. "What's her name?" she asked quietly. Dante almost refused to answer. June's name was not another thing for this room to touch. But he thought of his daughter drawing the yellow door, and something in him softened despite himself. "June," he said. "She's 6. Grant looked away quickly, blinking hard. Even a few guests shifted as if the number had made the whole thing harder to dismiss. 6 was not an idea. 6 was small shoes by the door, missing front teeth, bedtime questions, drawings taped to refrigerators. Helena pressed a hand lightly to her mouth, and her mother, Dante's, eyes lowered for the first time. Gone. 2 years now. The answer stripped the room of whatever was left of its glamour. No chandelier could soften that truth. No expensive music could make it less stark. Dante had not come into the mansion as a legend or a threat. He had come as a widower trying to buy boots for a motherless child. Helena stepped back as if the knowledge had physically touched her. "I am sorry," she whispered. Dante nodded once, but the apology for Lena's death was not the one he needed. "Being sorry is easy tonight," he said. "Everyone is watching." Helena absorbed that without defending herself, and that was the first sign Dante believed might be real. A minute earlier, she would have cut him down for speaking to her that way. Now she simply asked, "Then what does a real apology look like?" Dante looked around the room at the guests, the staff lingering at the edges, Grant standing with his hands curled at his sides. He understood then that solving the conflict did not mean making Helena suffer. It meant refusing to let the truth disappear once the discomfort passed. "Start by remembering the people who work for you are people when nobody is watching," he said. "Start there." Helena nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Don't say it because it sounds good," Dante replied. "Do it when you're bored. Do it when you're angry. Do it when no one will praise you for it." For the first time all night, Helena looked at him not like a servant, not like a former fighter, not like a man who had made her ashamed, but like someone whose judgment she feared losing. "And you?" she asked. "What can I do for you?" That question brought the hardest feeling of all into Dante's chest. Need. He hated needing anything from her. He hated that the money still mattered after all this. He hated that dignity and survival had been placed on opposite sides of a scale, and he had to choose like a man with no clean options. But June's face came back to him again, and with it came clarity. The night had already taken his pride. Refusing help now just to feel noble would not feed his child. "You made an offer," he said. Helena did not hesitate. "I did." A murmur passed through the room, but she lifted a hand and silenced it. "And I will honor it." Dante's throat tightened, not from triumph, but from the terrible relief of a father who had been holding up a collapsing roof and suddenly felt another pair of hands beneath the beam. Helena turned to a man near the doorway and asked for her checkbook, then stopped and corrected herself. "No, a transfer. Tonight, properly documented." It was practical, serious, stripped of theatrics. Dante appreciated that more than she knew. Grant stepped closer, his voice rough. "Mr. Bell." Dante looked at him. "Dante," he said. The bodyguard swallowed, and the giant man seemed almost boyish for a moment. "Dante, I'm sorry you had to stand through that." Dante held out his hand. Grant stared at it as if it were an honor he had not earned, then took it. "You did the right thing," Dante said. "That cost you something." Grant's eyes filled. "Not as much as it would have cost me to throw that punch." In that handshake, something began to heal that had nothing to do with Helena's money. Two men who understood violence stood in the middle of a room built on wealth and silently agreed that restraint was the better legacy. Helena watched them, and Dante saw that she understood at least partly that the most important exchange of the night was not the $1 million. It was the choice not to harm when harm would have been easy. As the party dissolved around them, guests leaving quietly now, no longer eager to be seen, Dante felt the consequences of his choice settle over him. Tomorrow, maybe someone would still talk. Maybe his name would return to places he had left behind. Maybe June would one day ask questions he was not ready to answer. But for the first time in years, Dante did not feel hunted by his past. He had faced it in the open, and he had not let it own him. Helena approached one last time, no glass in her hand, no smile prepared. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight," she said. Dante looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he answered, "because I don't know if I do." She nodded, accepting the pain of that. Dante picked up his tray not because anyone needed champagne now, but because finishing his work mattered to him. Before he walked away, he added, "But people can become better than their worst moment. I have to believe that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here." Helena's eyes lowered, and for the first time Dante saw not a billionaire, not a villain, not a woman with too much power, but a lonely person staring at the damage she had done and wondering whether there was still time to become someone else. That was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the beginning of reconciliation, and for that night, beginning was enough. The party did not end with music, laughter, or the clinking of crystal glasses. It ended in the strange quiet that comes when people have seen too much truth and do not know where to place their eyes. One by one, Helena Voss's guests began leaving the ballroom, their expensive coats gathered over their arms, their voices lowered now to careful whispers. They no longer looked at Dante Bell like a server, but they did not look at him comfortably either. Recognition had not made them kind. It had made them ashamed, and shame is a difficult thing for proud people to carry. Dante stood near the edge of the room with his tray under one arm, watching the world return slowly to motion. Staff members moved carefully around broken conversations. Grant Maddox stood near the main doors, no longer in the posture of a hired guard, but of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the consequences. Helena remained by the long marble table, speaking quietly with her attorney and financial manager, both of whom had been pulled from somewhere else in the mansion after she demanded the transfer be made immediately. Dante did not know how a woman like Helena moved $1 million, whether it required signatures, calls, passwords, or the nod of men in dark suits. But he knew the moment was real when she turned back to him with no performance left in her face. "It's done," she said. "The funds will be placed in a trust for your daughter by morning, unless you prefer another arrangement." The words struck Dante harder than he expected. Until that second, the $1 million had been an idea, a number bright enough to make humiliation worth swallowing. Now it had become real, and reality made his knees feel unsteady in a way no fighter ever had. June would have a future. June would have a roof that did not leak cold air. June would have books, school trips, doctors, college, maybe even the yellow door she kept drawing with her crayons. Dante lowered his eyes because if he looked too long at anyone, he might break in front of them. "A trust is good," he said. "For June. All of it for June." Helena nodded and something softened in her expression. "You won't keep any for yourself?" Dante almost smiled, though it was a tired smile. A father's self is usually folded somewhere inside his child's needs. Grant looked away, pretending to check the door, but Dante saw him wipe at one eye. Helena heard the sentence and seemed to understand that money, for all its power, had entered a world of love it could not measure. Then, the silver-haired guest who had mentioned Rory Keane stepped forward again. His name, Dante had learned from the whispers, was Everett Sloane, an old investor with a reputation for enjoying the weaknesses of others. He had not left with the rest. Perhaps pride kept him there, perhaps guilt. Perhaps he simply could not resist one final attempt to reclaim control of the story. "This is very touching," Everett said, his voice dry. "But are we all meant to forget what he admitted? He nearly killed a man. Now we're handing him a fortune and calling it virtue." The room stiffened. Grant's shoulders tightened, and Helena's head snapped toward Everett with visible anger. But Dante raised one hand before anyone else could speak. He was tired of people using Rory as either a weapon or a symbol. Rory had been a living man, not a line in someone's argument. "No," Dante said. "Nobody should forget Rory Keane." Everett looked surprised that Dante had not denied him. Dante stepped closer, his voice steady, carrying through the thinning ballroom. "I have not forgotten him for one day. I remember the punch. I remember the stretcher. I remember his mother's face. I remember sitting in that hospital hallway making bargains with God because I was terrified my hands had taken a son from someone. If you think that money tonight washes that away, you're wrong. Nothing washes that away. The only thing I could do was let it change me." Everett's expression faltered, but Dante was not finished. That is what people like you often miss. You think a man is either his worst moment or his greatest success. You want him trapped in one headline, one mistake, one victory, one failure, because it makes him easier to judge. But a life is not one moment. A life is what a person does after the moment that reveals him. Helena lowered her eyes. The words were for Everett, but they reached her too. They reached everyone. Dante felt the weight of the night shifting toward its final truth. Rory lived, he continued. Thank God. He recovered, though he never fought again. And I never fought again either. Not because the world forced me to stop, because my daughter was born and I held her with the same hands that had almost ended a young man's life. I decided those hands would work hold, feed, protect, and comfort. I decided they would not hurt again. Tonight I kept that promise. That is the only victory I'm claiming. For the first time, Everett had nothing ready to say. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Helena stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Sloane, you should leave. Everett looked at her, startled. Helena? No, she said, and there was no cruelty in her tone now, only a boundary. I invited people into my home tonight and allowed them to behave as if wealth made us superior to decency. I did that. I encouraged it, but it ends here. Everett's face reddened, but the room had already turned away from him. There was no audience left for his contempt. He left without another word, and the sound of the front door closing somewhere beyond the hall felt like the end of more than one man's presence. Helena stood still after he was gone, as if listening to the echo of the kind of world she had built around herself. Then she turned to the remaining staff. Everyone working tonight will be paid triple, she said, and anyone who wants to leave may leave now with full pay. The staff stared at her, uncertain. Helena looked at Dante briefly, then added, No one in this house is invisible tonight. Not again. It was not redemption. Dante knew that. Redemption was not a sentence spoken under a chandelier. It was repetition. It was tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, when no crowd remained to admire the change. But even so, something had begun. Grant removed the earpiece from his collar and placed it on a side table. Helena saw the gesture and understood before he spoke. I can't continue as your guard, he said. His voice was respectful but final. Not after tonight. A flicker of pain crossed Helena's face, not because she was losing an employee, but because she knew she had earned the loss. I understand, she said. Grant nodded, then turned to Dante. For a moment, the giant man looked like the boy he had once been, staring up at a poster of an undefeated fighter who taught him that survival was possible. You were the reason I walked into a gym the first time, Grant said. I thought being strong meant learning how to hit harder than the world. Tonight, I think I finally understood what you were really teaching. Dante put a hand on his shoulder. Then teach it better than I did, he said. There are boys out there who need to know they don't have to become weapons just because life hits them first. Grant nodded, and in that nod was the beginning of his next life. Hours later, when the mansion had emptied and the sky outside had turned pale at the edges, Dante finally went home. The city looked different from the back seat of the car Helena had insisted he take, but Dante knew it was not the city that had changed. It was the weight inside his chest. For years, poverty had sat there like a hand pressing down. Tonight, that hand had lifted, but another feeling had taken its place. The fragile fear of a man who had been given a miracle and did not yet trust himself to hold it. He paid the sitter extra from the cash Helena's assistant had given him for the ride home, then stepped quietly into the apartment. It was small, colder than it should have been, with June's drawings taped crookedly to the refrigerator. There it was again. The house with the yard, the swing, the yellow door. Dante touched the paper with 2 fingers and felt tears finally rise. In June's room, the nightlight painted soft stars across the ceiling. She was asleep on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Dante stood in the doorway for a long time. The world had seen him that night as a former fighter, a poor server, a target, a legend, a danger, a father. But here in this room, he was only Daddy. That was the name that mattered. He sat carefully on the edge of her bed and pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. June stirred, blinking sleepily. "Daddy," she whispered. Dante brushed a curl from her forehead with the gentlest hand in the world. "I'm here, baby. Did work go okay?" The question nearly broke him. He thought of the laughter that bet Grant's pale face, Helena's apology, the trust that would change June's life by morning. Then he looked at his daughter and understood the simplest truth of the night. Everything he had endured had been for this small voice in the dark. "Yeah," he said softly. "Work went okay." June's eyes closed again. "Can we still draw our house tomorrow?" Dante looked back toward the refrigerator, toward the yellow door waiting on paper. His voice shook, but only a little. "Yes," he said, "and maybe soon we'll make it real." She smiled in her sleep, and that smile gave him something no championship ever had. Peace. In the months that followed, the story of that night did not become what the guests wanted it to become. There was no viral video, because Helena made sure the recordings disappeared and the staff were protected. June's trust was established. Dante bought a modest house with a yard, not a mansion, not a monument to pride. Just a safe place where his daughter could run barefoot in summer and tape drawings on a refrigerator that belonged to them. Grant began training young fighters at a community gym, teaching them footwork discipline and the sacred art of walking away. Helena changed slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. She created a foundation for children who had lost parents, raised wages for her household staff, and wrote Dante a letter months later saying that mercy had humiliated her more deeply than revenge ever could have, because mercy left her alone with the truth. Dante kept the letter but did not answer for a long time. Forgiveness, he believed, was not something owed on demand. It was something that grew when change proved itself patient. But he did hope for her. That surprised him. After everything, he hoped Helena would become better. Not because she deserved it easily, but because June lived in a world that needed powerful people to learn tenderness before they did more harm. And Dante had learned that love was not only what a father gave his child. Love was also the force that kept a man from passing his pain into someone else. Love was the reason he left the ring. Love was the reason he took the bet. Love was the reason he did not strike back. In the end, the strongest thing Dante Bell ever did was not survive a punch. The punch was never thrown. The strongest thing he ever did was stand in a room full of people who had mistaken cruelty for power and show them another kind, the power to be wounded without becoming cruel, to be humiliated without becoming hateful, to have hands capable of destruction and choose to use them only for work, mercy, and tucking a blanket beneath a little girl's chin. Years before, Dante had given up a championship to become a father. That night he discovered he had not lost the title after all. He had simply traded it for a better one.